This is my book of short stories, Feeling the Fear and Other Intriguing Tales. And I'm now going to read you one of them. It's called Cassocks and Kilts. Before I begin this sorry, or some may say sordid little tale, I must first apologise for blatantly using you as a form of confessional. But I feel, unless I unburden myself now, I shall go completely mad. The story revolves around our greatest friends, Alan and Teresa, in the 25th year of their marriage. Now, you may choose to find it all amusing and vaguely titillating, or you could treat it as a fable and reflect on your own particular friendships at this time, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Alan and Teresa were the backbone of our little group of friends, the linchpins, the mainstay, the very foundations that we all, without exception, leaned upon. Predictable, reliable, honourable and steadfast are just some of the adjectives I'd use to describe them. They were always there for us in times of trouble and in times of joy. Alan was a clergyman, a beautiful man both outwardly and inwardly, tactile and demonstrative, with an infinite compassion for the frailty of his fellow human beings. So a clergyman should be, you might be thinking. You're right, but how many do you know? And Teresa? Well, frankly, there is only one word to describe Teresa: saintly. There were occasions, and I feel awful saying this, when we could have throttled her. I mean, there are times, I think you'll agree, when one should call a spade, but not Teresa. Oh dear me, no. She found good in everyone, and nothing was too much trouble for her. I'll give you an example. When Will, my husband, was laid up with sciatica, and I was at that sink or swim stage of my little dress agency business, who stepped into the breach and made Will lunch every day? You've got it. Mother Teresa. Will hated it when I called her that, said I was a bitch. Goodness does have a way of making one feel guilty, don't you think? There were 10 of us in the inner sanctum of our group, including Alan and Teresa. There was Fenny and Mikey. They were the golden oldies and had both long hit fifthly. Sadly, Fenny had also hit the bottle, but Alan was amazing with her. He became a sort of Alan Anonymous, there for her whenever she needed a drink. Poor old Mikey rather resented it. I think it made him feel inadequate. Early retirement hadn't suited him at all. Noel and Bunty, they're gay men in case you're wondering, and run a terrific florist shop called Gay Bouquets. Now they both willingly would have laid their lives down for Alan, who married them unofficially in his church. Quite something for a C of E parson, don't you think? The talk he gave on the day was wonderful, all about love and how in the eyes of God all love between two people, whatever their sex, is sacred and should be celebrated, not condemned. His voice trembled with emotion. It was a deeply moving experience. Then there were Scott and Polly. They'd only been in our group for the past 10 years, but we all adored them. I suppose them being actors made them more interesting than the rest of us. They were great ones for games evenings. You should have seen Alan playing Guess Who. You know that game when you have to act out a character. His Maggie Thatcher was brilliant, and as for his Anne Widdecombe, if you shut your eyes you could have sworn it was her. I think Teresa faintly disapproved, though she never showed it. Fixed grin throughout, while we all just fell about. And lastly, there was us. We'd known them the longest. Will had been at school with Alan and was his best friend. In fact, they'd both studied theology together at Oxford and were inseparable till Alan took up the cloth and Will went into teaching. When I first came on the scene, I felt that Alan was quite hostile towards me. There's something impenetrable about the bond between two men, don't you think? Anyway, all's well that ends well. Alan was the best man at our wedding, and I think it's safe to say that we were their closest friends. After all, our kids grew up together, our parents knew their parents, and we really had no secrets from each other. Or so I thought. We all live in and around Thatchley Cross, and for those of you who don't know it, it's It's a pretty little market town. Most of the thatched roofs from which it derived its name have long since been replaced, but it still has an aura of quaint old England. At the time that all this happened, we hadn't seen much of Alan, who had been away on a sabbatical. Teresa told us in confidence that he'd sort of worn himself out with being a good Christian and was taking time alone to reflect on his own internal life. Well, now I've filled you in, we can go back to that phone call, which came late on a Friday night when we were going to bed. It was Alan. He sounded so serious and, well, I think portentous is the word I'm looking for. He asked if we could come over the following evening, as he had something of the utmost importance to tell us all. I was more than a little hurt. We hadn't seen him in over 3 months, and he didn't even ask me how I was. So unlike Alan. Will was his usual switched-off self when I tried to talk to him about it. I suppose I should tell you here that ours is not a marriage made in heaven. We never really got the sex thing right, and because we're both quite reserved, the subject has always been taboo. I suspect I have a low sexual libido and have to admit to being vastly relieved when our Saturday night copulations ceased 3 years ago. We all arrived at the same time, each of us bursting with curiosity. Teresa showed us in and was looking absolutely beautiful in that pure way of hers. I noticed the hall was full of suitcases and briefly wondered why. Alan, who was wearing his cassock, was pouring out wine and handing it to each of us in turn, along with a bear-like hug. He looked different somehow. His hair was longer and he put on weight. We stood around for a bit trying to act as normal. Bunty and Noel were particularly talkative. And then Alan walked over to the fireplace and turned to face us all. He cleared his throat and the room fell silent. Teresa glided up and sat serenely by him on the arm of the armchair. I'll try to remember his exact words. "Firstly, I want to thank you all for coming at such short notice," he said, "and to ask you, my dearest friends, for your forgiveness and for your understanding." Bunty said, "Whatever for?" Typical, he could never keep his mouth shut. We all glared at him. Alan just ignored him and went on talking and said that what he was about to tell us would soon be public knowledge and probably the source of much derision. The suspense in the room was quite unbearable. Then he dropped the first bombshell. "This is the last time you will see me wearing my cassock." He gave us a moment to take that in. So that was it, I thought. Alan was about to give up God. Then came the second bombshell. "This is also the last time you will see me as a man." We all looked at each other. What was he talking about? I looked up at Will, who was looking across at Teresa, who, believe it or not, was still smiling. Suddenly it struck me. She looked just like the Mona Lisa. You know that furtive, I've got a secret look? Alan told us that all his life he had had a problem with his sexuality. The mind of a woman trapped in the body of a man. Those were his words. That from tomorrow we would see him as a woman. We must no longer call him Alan, but Alana, and he hoped and prayed that this would not change our feelings of affection for him. We must try to understand that he was putting all manly things behind him. I noticed Bunty and Noel nudging each other at that moment. This may all sound rather fanciful to you, but that is exactly how it happened. We all reacted differently. Fenny emptied her tomato juice into a nearby cactus pot, headed straight for the drinks cabinet and poured out the largest scotch I've ever seen. Mikey was shocked to the core. I mean, he's a Freemason. He's barely tolerated Noel and Bunty. They, of course, were in their element, went straight up to Alan and flung their arms around him. Will got up and said he was going to the lavatory. Scott and Polly just took it in their stride. Nothing phases them. I've noticed it before. I suppose being creative frees the spirit. how much better the world would be if we could all be like them. Teresa said she would make some tea. Amazing woman. I think the most affected person there that day was me. You see, here comes the confession. Alan was more than just a friend to me. Look, I am old-fashioned. I don't believe in all this kiss-and-tell malarkey, but let it just be said that things went on between us in the vestry. Call me kinky if you like, but men in cassocks turn my low libido on, as do men in kilts. I haven't missed a Highland Games in years, and Greek tragedy is my favourite form of theatre. I also have a predilection for Morris dancers. We never did the full thing, our principles forbade it, but I can state categorically that Alan was a man in a big way, and, not to labour the point, in full working order, so you can imagine my confusion. I just kept looking up at him, standing there in his cassock for the last time. I felt the old familiar excitement in the pit of my stomach and decided I must go home and sort my feelings out. Will was nowhere to be found. The 2 vicarage lavatories were empty. I headed to the kitchen to ask Teresa if she had seen him, but she wasn't there. Come to think of it, we never had that cup of tea. I headed back to the hall where everyone else was leaving. I asked if anyone had seen Will, but no one had. There were fond farewell and promises of continued friendship, except Mikey, who refused point blank to shake Alan's hand. Fanny was paralytic, draped herself round Alan, I felt, for longer than was necessary, but perhaps I was being oversensitive. After Alan had closed the front door, we went in search of Will and Teresa. We found the note on the kitchen table, leaning up against the teapot. It was Teresa's handwriting, but Will had signed his name. It simply stated, no apologies, they were going off to start a new life together. I should have noticed the cases were no longer in the hall. I suppose there were a whole lot of other things I should have noticed too. Alan and I just stood staring at each other. I found myself questioning my own sexuality. You see, here I was, facing an unfrocked vicar who was about to wear a frock. And as you don't really know me, I'm going to tell you this. I've never been so excited in all my adult life.